Okay, super. So hi. Sorry that you're getting two video presentations kind of at front here. I planned to be with you guys last week when I think we originally had this scheduled, but it got moved back because of the Sperry Symposium, and now I am I'd already committed to come out here to USC and then Santa Barbara with Margaret Barker, and we're doing some presentations along with a bunch of others for some conferences here. And but I think there's like a great mystery in how this is unfolding. You have Jeff, who kind of gave you a pre-recorded message. That's kind of a celestial courtyard kind of level. Here I am live via video. So all the presenters after me will be the bodily appearance of the divine in your midst. So, all right. So I'm going to shift to my screen here and let you see my presentation, and then I'll come back on for, well, if I have time, I'll come back on for questions. I actually have another presentation I'm supposed to go to in half an hour, so we'll see how this goes. So there is this idea that, as I mentioned, that that some things are hidden right in the scriptures. So all these things, Matthew says, spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable spake he not unto them, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. While this text appears to indicate that the parables contain the mysteries, Jesus states that one must be instructed on how to bring out the hidden truths. As he says later in that same chapter, then said he unto them, therefore every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is a householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old. In other words, one must be instructed unto the kingdom of heaven to understand the mystery. You need to understand the mystery to see the mystery, I guess, in the scriptures. And he said unto them, unto you, speaking to his disciples, is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. But unto them that are without or outside the kingdom, all these things are done in parables. The early church father Origen said it this way: for the sake of those who either could not or would not give themselves to this labor and toil by which they would deserve to be instructed in things of such value and importance, God purposed to wrap up and conceal in ordinary language, under the covering of some history and narrative of visible things, hidden mysteries. Nephi, who began his record by declaring that he had a great knowledge of the mysteries, declared that he, his brother Jacob, and Isaiah had seen God, the ultimate revelation of the mystery. And then immediately after stating that, says, behold, my soul delighteth in proving unto my people the truth of the coming of Christ. For this end hath the law of Moses been given, and all things which have been given of God from the beginning of the world unto man are the typifying of him. In other words, because of his understanding of the plan as revealed in the mystery, Nephi saw beyond the superficial layers of the law of Moses, and even beyond all things, to the more profound meaning that it all has, typifying Christ. That is Nephi's delight, and it is also our delight, which is why we're here today. I, along with many of you, have found that the instructions given and the mystery revealed in the physical model, the ritual program, and the covenants of the temple, both ancient and modern, to be a very satisfying tool and framework for approaching, understanding, and interpreting Scripture. At our last TMZ conference 2 years ago, I shared how the temple may have been the governing structure that John had in mind as he crafted his gospel. He appears to be selecting and ordering events in the Lord's life that reflect the sequence and progressive rituals of the temple in order to convey the mystery of the whole plan of salvation to the reader. During that presentation, I teased the audience with a few slides that previewed what I'm going to share today. Namely, that the story cycles of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can be meaningfully understood as reflections of the temple progression and plan of salvation as well. Like the main divisions of the temple, there is a threefold pattern in the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. First, all three stories begin with a preparatory sacrifice echoing the altar of the courtyard. Second, all three stories figuratively move us towards the temple proper, wherein they receive the new and everlasting covenant of marriage and are instructed in the creation and the plan of salvation. And then third, all three stories demonstrate how the patriarchs and matriarchs prove themselves willing to sacrifice all things to the point that God swears an oath to them, making sure the promises echoing the incense altar, the veil, and the most holy place of the temple. And never mind, I'll come back to that. Okay, so let's review all three narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at each of these three steps or chapters of the story in order to better see any interconnections between the stories. So chapter 1, the patriarchs demonstrate their initial willingness to sacrifice to God, the altar of the courtyard. It must be understood at this outset that in Genesis, the story cycle of Abraham, when compared with Isaac and Jacob, is not complete without the restored Abraham text that Joseph Smith gives us in the book of Abraham. In chapter 1 of Abraham, we learned that Abraham was placed on an altar and almost sacrificed his own life in defending the kingdom of God by opposing his fathers and the false religion to which they had turned, not bowing down to their gods. Verse 10 of the story of Abraham is particularly instructive as it declares that even the thank offering of a child did the priest of Pharaoh offer upon the altar which stood by the hill called Potiphar's Hill at the head of the plain of Olishem. Note that the specific location of Abraham's altar is declared here to be by or next to, not on or upon the hill called Potiphar's Hill. This is significant, for offering altars in both Egyptian and Israelite tradition are usually next to and outside their associated mountain or temple or pyramid. The hill was called Potiphar, which in Egyptian is Padi Re, which literally translates the one that Re gives, suggesting that this was a temple related to the sun god, which the book of Abraham affirms in the previous verse. And it came to pass that the priest made an offering unto the god of Pharaoh, who is Re, and also to the god of Shagrael, even after the manner of the Egyptians. Now the god of Shagrael was the sun. So Abraham's story again begins with the initial sacrifice of Abraham willing to show God his devotion. So for Isaac, in Genesis 22, 7 through 12, the story cycle of Isaac begins with his own near sacrifice on an altar under the hand of his father, similar to Abraham's, of course. Others have already commented on the likelihood of Isaac's role in being willing to submit to this act. The similarities and differences between the stories of Abraham and Isaac will have to be teased out at a later time. But again, I just wanted to make sure that we're starting the cycle of Abraham at that moment. And then lastly, the sacrifice in the story of Jacob takes a different approach in Genesis 27, 9 through 16. Here we read, that Rebekah said to Jacob, "Go now to the flock and fetch from me 2 kids of the goats, and I will make them savory meat for thy father, such as he loveth. And thou shalt bring it to the altar, or to thy father, that he may eat, and that he may bless thee before his death." And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "Behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man." And Rebekah took goodly raiment of her eldest son Esau, which was in her house, and put them upon Jacob her younger son. And she put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands and upon the smooth of his neck. The old rabbis noted long ago that Rebekah's request for 2 goats and her adorning Jacob with Esau's goodly raiment is probably a textual echo of the Day of Atonement sacrifice of the 2 goats noted in Leviticus 16, and the high priestly raiment of the officiant. 1 goat is offered to the Lord as an acceptable sacrifice, in other words, Jacob, while the other goat is driven out into the wilderness, just as Esau will be later in the story. And by the way, the Hebrew word describing Esau as a hairy man is sair, the same word for goat. Thus, Jacob also becomes a goat by putting on the skins. And so each brother represents the 2 goats. Jacob's offering is accepted by Isaac, who is the Lord, and who gives Jacob then the promises. So chapter 2, each of the patriarchs get married and enter into the new and everlasting covenant and receive temple instruction. So scholars have already noted the 7 lights of the menorah of the temple was equated to the 7 planets. So the concept of being instructed in astronomy kind of fits here. And the table of showbread with its 12 loaves relates to the seed of Abraham promised in the Abrahamic covenant. So in the story cycle of Abraham, of course, we read that he gets married in Abraham chapter 2 or Genesis chapter 12. And he enters into the new and everlasting covenant with God, wherein God promises him land or a kingdom, seed, and priesthood to bless all the families of the earth. The book of Abraham again supplements and records that Abraham received divine instruction in relationship to the premortal council and astronomy and the creation of the earth and the plan of salvation in Abraham's chapters 3 through 5. The story of Isaac in Genesis 24, 64 through 67, Isaac gets married. And then after an interlude, the Isaac story continues in Genesis 26, and he receives the promises of the new and everlasting covenant. No mention in Genesis of a temple-like instruction concerning creation and plan of salvation exists for Isaac, and I haven't looked up the apocryphal writings yet. So if any of you know off the top of your head of any extra biblical sources containing a vision of Isaac of the heavens, I'd really love to know that. So for Jacob in Genesis 28, 1 through 3, 10 through 22, Jacob seeks a wife and then has a vision of a ladder into heaven. He calls the ladder the gate of heaven and names the place Bethel, right? The house of God. Joseph Smith said, "Wherefore we again say, search the revelations of God, study the prophecies, and rejoice that God grants unto the world seers and prophets. They are they who saw the mysteries of godliness. They saw the flood before it came. They saw angels ascending and descending upon a ladder that reached earth to heaven." And then elsewhere, Joseph says, Paul ascended into the third heaven, and he could have understood, and he could understand the 3 principal rounds of Jacob's ladder, the telestial, the terrestrial, and the celestial glories or kingdoms, where Paul saw and heard things which were not lawful for him to utter. I could explain 100-fold more than I ever have of these glories of the kingdoms manifested to me in the vision where I permitted and where the people are prepared to receive them. So the idea here is that at least Abraham and Jacob, in connection with their marriages, right, seem to have these visions of expanding their mind and seeing the history of the world from beginning to end, and having that plan of salvation revealed to them, such as a temple experience provides. So chapter 3, the patriarchs are tested further and receive the oath of God, making their blessings sure. The altar of the holy place is a greater sacrifice than the altar of the courtyard. God speaks through the veil, making sure the promises. So Abraham and Sarah are tested after their marriage and the visions that Abraham receives, or they're tested to see if they will do all things, right, to preserve the covenant. In Genesis, Sarah's test with Pharaoh and Abimelech in chapters 12 and 20 requires her, right, to give herself to these kings in order to save Abraham's life, thus preserving the covenant. In Genesis 22, 1 through 2, Abraham's test is to sacrifice Isaac. And then following that experience, we read this. And Abraham called the name of the place Jehovah Yireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, By myself I have sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. So on August 27, 1843, Joseph Smith gave a sermon on the three orders of the priesthood, paralleling, I believe, these three chapters of the stories that we're reviewing here. And in this sermon, Joseph stated that Abraham entered into the highest order or fullness of the priesthood by the offering of his son Isaac, providing a unique view of this moment as a means to obtain the promises of God in relationship to the Holy of Holies. Abraham called this place Jehovah Yireh, which most translations render it as the Lord will provide, but the literal translation is the Lord shall be seen. The text immediately states that Abraham dwelt at Beersheba, which is literally the well of the oath. So as the story cycle of Abraham concludes with the sacrifice of Isaac, showing his full willingness to sacrifice all, right? So that Melchizedek altar that exists inside the temple as opposed to the altar outside, we then have Melchizedek receiving the oath from God, making his promises sure, repeating the Abrahamic covenant, but with that oath, by myself I have sworn, saith the Lord. Isaac's third chapter appears in Genesis 26, 6 through 12. Isaac and Rebekah are tested in the same manner as Sarah and Abraham. Rebekah also, in likeness, has to give herself to a king to save Isaac. And the text has Isaac following in the footsteps of his father, Abraham, redigging all the wells that Abraham had previously dug. And then the cycle of Isaac concludes in Genesis 26, 23 through 25, wherein Isaac concluded his well digging, and he went up from thence to Beersheba, the same well of the oath where Abraham went as soon as he received his oath from God. And in that context, the verse 24 states, and the Lord appeared unto Isaac the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. So I believe that verse, in the context of the Beersheba well of the oath, is following the pattern, is Isaac's election being made sure, his blessings being made sure by God. And then in the story cycle of Jacob has this concluding chapter in Genesis 32, 24 to 32, where Jacob meets an angel and wrestles with him. And Jacob's wrestling and prevailing can be interpreted here as his passing the tests and trials of mortality and being accepted before God. And the angel said, let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. So God swears an oath, giving Jacob power in his priesthood as a prince, a full heir, which is what other scriptures and Joseph Smith teach elsewhere is the blessing of those who obtain the fullness of the priesthood, to be endowed with that power in the priesthood, that fullness. And he also requests the name and declares that he has seen God in this text. So this temple or plan of salvation progression can roughly be seen in the vignettes that Joseph Smith chooses from the Egyptian papyri to illustrate Abraham's story, which was not fully published. A sacrificial scene echoing the courtyard altar, a hypocephalus echoing the instructional vision of heaven and earth and hell that the temple gives, that astronomy, an enthronement scene where Abraham has overcome the world and sits as God, filled with power and wisdom. Seeing the mystery in these stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob repeatedly provides the reader the way back to God and the sacrifices and the covenants that are necessary to see God and obtain all that the Father has. And that's it. Thank you. Um, yeah, so I think it seems to be a little more obvious in other stories where once the prophets have entered into that Holy of Holies, have had that oath sworn to them, as Joseph Smith's translation of Genesis 14 kind of indicates, right? That they are endowed with power and they can then move mountains and divide the seas and stand in the presence of God. And it's a good question as far as continuing in the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, I guess right off the top of my head, I'm not really thinking of any demonstrations of these great powers like we see in Moses' story, where he divides the seas and calls down the plagues from heaven, and Enoch's great powers that move mountains, etc. And so I think that's true. They come out of that temple with the fullness of the priesthood, then having all the titles that the priesthood offers. So all who enter into that order receive or become, as Joseph Smith actually indicated in that same sermon that I mentioned, they become apostles. They're not only apostles, prophets, but they're also kings and high priests unto God. And so every man becomes a prophet, every woman becomes a prophetess, every man becomes a high priest, every woman a high priestess, and all the titles of the priesthood become connected in one in that fullness. Whereas on our way to that fullness, we're all kind of receiving the different offices and having different experiences in fragmented ways. But it all gets bound up into one priesthood, one fullness, even of all the offices and all the powers. So in that sense, they come out as angels having that power of God on the earth. They become seers, right? Which power no greater power can be given unto man on the earth, as we learn from the Book of Mormon. But how that's manifested in the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob I don't think it's as clear as it is in the Moses story and others. So you mentioned, sorry, there was 7 to 10 tests of Abraham. Yeah. So yeah, there's certainly a whole series of tests that he and Sarah seem to be going through, and at least for me, the literature of the Bible is kind of portraying it in this movement of Abraham as he's moving around digging these wells, and he's having interactions with these various kings, and so I can see that that God is testing him to the fullness, and the story of Isaac becomes that crowning moment. So to rephrase your question as far as what you mean then by Isaac and Jacob in this regard. Yeah. So as I mentioned, Isaac and Rebecca have almost a duplicate test where Rebecca has to say to a king that he's my brother, and then she's taken into the king's house, and same thing happens in the story of Isaac. So you almost get a repetition, letting you know that they're having similar tests that Abraham and Sarah are having. Now, as far as a binding and sacrificial moment of, I don't see that in the text as clear as we see it in Abraham's story. Jacob's story, you could look at Jacob's story as including the idea of all the labor he's doing, to obtain Rachel. Yeah, I think, matter of fact, I don't think I addressed some of the tests that Jacob goes through in the text, so I left that out. But there are some things in there too that will be in my paper. But I've got to go now, so sorry.